Welcome to Welcome Change, our weekly news series where we meet social entrepreneurs and we hear what's working and what's next. My name is Irene and I'm joining today from Madrid. On Valentine's Day, I don't think there can be anything better than to talk about one of the most important schools of love, which is families. I'm delighted to be here with Diana Adams, a new Ashoka Fellow in New York. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you for coming. And before we jump in, I just want to do a little reminder about the format. We're going to have 30 minutes today. So Diana and I will talk for the first 15, 20 minutes. And then we're going to try to turn to a few of your questions before we wrap up. When you're curious about something, when you have something that you really want to ask, please use your Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And now we can get started. Diana, you're a lawyer like me.
Yes, I am.
Yes, you are. We are. And you founded the Chosen Family Law Center. And the mission of the Chosen Family Law Center is to update and expand the legal definition of family and care structures in the US, but also in Europe. Can you share a little bit of the demographic and cultural shifts that are making this work particularly relevant now? For example, the difficulty that many parents, including myself, experience without extended family in cities or friends that are nearby to help. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yes, I've been really passionate about supporting what started for me as thinking about queer families and ways that we could think as feminists and as queer people about what family needs to be. As I've been in the movement in the US, that's been very much a push for same-sex marriage in the LGBTQ legal movement. And I've always been one of those to say, yes, that's important. We need to get marriage, but by allowing same-sex couples to enter into the institution of marriage, which has over 1,000 different rights and responsibilities under US law. I have to explain that to our European colleagues. It really means quite a bit more financially and legally in the US. But that's really leaving a lot of people out. And more people every year are not fitting into that marital box. And I've also seen that many of us are getting pushed into getting married when that may not be the right configuration for our family. I know so many couples. As a lawyer, I've been representing people since 2007 in New York City with my law practice, and worked with many people who were happy couples, but maybe got married not as the decision that they want to be romantically connected, but that's the time when they really need to share health insurance, or when it would make sense for taxes, or when they need it for immigration reasons, or to get a pension benefit. And that's not necessarily the way to create stable families. And the US government has really instituted all of these incentives for marriage with this idea that if we have a wedding ring, we magically have stability. And I think that there are many other ways to create that. And by thinking about this and looking into this, I realized we call other kinds of families non-traditional families. And I really try to encourage us to get away from that, because actually living in the more extended families and more tight-knit, multi-generational families and communities is what is traditional. And the nuclear family was much more a recent experiment, an experiment which has colossally failed for the well-being of women and children. And so I'm not anti-marriage. I am happily married. That's a photo of me and my husband and some flowers from him on Valentine's Day. Not against the institution of marriage at all, but just wanting to make sure that we're uplifting other options, because actually it's quite startling, the statistics, that only 80% of American adults are doing something different than a married couple in their first marriage living in a nuclear family with kids. So 80% of us are doing something different. Only 18% of us are actually in that nuclear family with children that we're calling, what is supposedly the majority of us, what we imagine culturally is the majority of us, when everybody else thinks they're doing something wrong. And I think that it's important that we shift out of that into thinking about what else are people doing to combat isolation, to find means of community support, to provide caretaking for children and elders, to band together in times of difficulty that we so crucially need. I think it's really valuable to think about what those other kinds of family configurations are.
That's amazing, that number, 80%.
It's really startling.
Families. It's really startling. I've heard you say before that family choice is a feminist issue, but also I've heard you say that family choice can strengthen marriages. Some people might be surprised to hear this. Maybe you can elaborate on this a bit and maybe tell us about specific cases or situations that you've worked on.
Yes, thank you. And to me, the ability to form family the way that we wish to feels like a feminist issue to me, an issue of bodily choice. Just as we talk about reproductive rights, I think this is one of our rights to be able to figure out how we want to have mutual support. And in particular, there is a narrative in the US that I've very much felt forced upon me that if you want to be a mother, you need to get married in order to find a way to support your children. And at first it was you need to marry a man. Now we've just recently expanded it to, or you could marry a woman, but we're still saying we need to get into this kind of financial unit and live as an isolated couple in order for that to be the most positive way for your child to grow up or the way that you get support. And I saw so many women when I was at Ivy League schools and so many brilliant, passionate, dynamic, brave women who are starting nonprofits in other countries and doing such bold things, but felt like I have to marry a man by the time I'm 30 or I've failed, and are getting back into this trap of just one narrow option. So I've seen so many other beautiful options for people to find means of support. And so, for example, I've worked in my law practice now with hundreds and hundreds of people since 2007 who are thinking about how can I create family in a different way. And I want to have a child, and I'm thinking about, I have to get married in order to do that, and helping them explore other options. And so one option that has become more prevalent and popular is doing what's called platonic co-parenting. And so with that might be a decision that somebody else is going to be there as a co-parent, really formally making that agreement. And it's not necessarily a romantic partner. And so that might be helping a woman decide, rather than, okay, I'm turning 40, I could marry a man that I've met on the internet 3 months ago and maybe come back to you for a divorce in a few years, which I've seen a lot. Or I have a gay best friend of 20 years. Maybe I could ask him if he wants to be a co-parent with me, and seeing those kinds of other options. Or I've helped to create collective housing for women who are single mothers, whether they're single mothers by choice or by incident, helping women to band together to provide mutual support, childcare cooperatives. There are so many isolated elders in our society, as well as 30% of American adults don't live with a romantic partner and may feel very, very isolated. There may be some of those people in your life who could be very interested in providing that extended care network within a household. So really intentionally saying, my sister is going to move in and my sister is going to be the person who's the other parent to this child, or acts as a parent to this child. So there are lots of ways that I think we could have a bit more creativity, because the old studies that we have always been used as the basis for the idea that a child needs a married mother and father really have all said that a child needs stability of parental figures. A child needs stability. And so it's not helpful if, you know somebody as your parent and then you're 3 years old and they disappear, you don't see them again, right? That can be destabilizing for a child, of course. But they make a logical leap from a child needs stability to therefore it must be a married mother and father through their own Christian values at the time. But we can instead say a child needs stability. And that means if my gay best friend decides he's living with us, I need to prioritize that relationship for the child. Or that stability can be me and my mom and my best friend. And providing other kinds of narratives so that we can have people think about these as other options that give them the freedom to choose if they wish to become parents, or without parenting, if they wish to have another adult in their lives that they feel can look after each other, whether it's financially or making medical decisions together. For that 30% of American adults who are single, many of them don't necessarily feel like they have anybody when they come to me as clients or community members whom they could ask about making medical decisions for them. And I think for many of us, we're more comfortable saying, hey, would you look after my dog when I'm out of town? By the way, my dog has diabetes. And if you notice these symptoms, they need a shot and they need some medical attention. They're more comfortable saying that about their pet than they are saying, hey, I have diabetes, Irina. If you notice that I'm having these symptoms, I might need some help. And so there are many single people who don't feel like they have anyone that they can be in those relationships with. And I want to offer us the permission that we all deserve caretaking. We all deserve mutual support, and it does not have to be a romantic relationship.
This is amazing. I love this way. I just bring so many things to me about thinking creatively about the relationships around us. And Diana, I know this is a special day. It's Valentine's Day, but also
Yes.
you told us that Berkeley and maybe Oakland might be passing some family status non-discrimination laws today. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this kind of legislation means and why is it important?
Yes, I'm excited. I work with an organization called Polyamory Legal Advocacy Coalition that I helped start through my nonprofit Chosen Family Law Center. And we're a team of lawyers and mental health professionals who have been helping to draft model ordinances that can be adapted for different cities and hopefully states in future, model ordinances for multi-partner domestic partnership and for family and relationship status non-discrimination. And what that means is that with multi-partner domestic partnership, this law is passed in 3 cities in Massachusetts, that any 2, 3, 4 people who want to say we are a family, or I am a family with her and I am a family with him, could go in and get registered as domestic partners. And it gets the state out of the business of deciding, is this a Judeo-Christian marriage? Is this a sacrament? And therefore, you deserve to be able to share your health insurance with this person. It gets the government out of being part of that really personal decision and saying, this is my person who's my domestic partner. Does it matter if they're my lover, they're my sister, they're my best friend? Doesn't matter. What matters to the government is that I want this person to be able to make my medical decisions. I want to be able to maybe share health insurance with them. I want them to be my special legal someone. I learned living in Europe during the pandemic, domestic partnership is a status where you can cross the border in a pandemic, like as a very close family member. So having that close family member status with somebody could be something that you could choose. You could elect. It's beyond whether they're in a romantic relationship of marriage or a blood relative, and you get to pick, because I think that's really empowering. So we've passed that in several places. And now what's happening in California, we've already passed it in several cities in Massachusetts, this family and relationship status non-discrimination law, because what that does is that helps to reduce stigma and say that you can't discriminate in situations, for example, such as employment or housing, on the basis of what kind of family status somebody is in. So people are not getting houses rented to them if they're saying, I want to live with my best friend and my kid and my mother. Many houses are still built and zoned for couples, even though the majority of us may be doing something a bit different. And we may be saying, hey, I want to live, my co-parent with whom I'm separated wants to have a floor downstairs with his wife, and I want to be upstairs with my wife, and we all want to buy a house together. This would say you can't discriminate against that family. You can't say I was looking for a traditional couple. You can't say I don't want to rent to a polyamorous triad, or you can't have a photo of your polyamorous triad on your desk at work. This is really making it clear that discrimination couldn't happen. And so that's the bill that has now been proposed in the first West Coast cities, in Berkeley and Oakland, California. It's being proposed this week in honor of Valentine's Day. It's being announced that they're going to be proposing that in that kind of idea of love is love, and that includes non-romantic love and platonic partners. And what's important to me about these non-discrimination laws is that we have lessons from the same-sex partnership movement, that this has been one of the most rapidly moving civil rights movements in history, because we've gone from, attitudes in the 1970s that homosexuality was wrong at very, very high rates. And then in part through the humanizing aspects of the AIDS crisis and realizing people had to come out, because it was like, wow, the man from my church has AIDS, and wow, this person's son is dying of AIDS. It was humanizing. We realized how prevalent it was. We realized how many people were in secrecy and hiding, and how terribly they were being treated. And then also we had in tandem then the same-sex partnership movement. And having something with a legal stamp of approval is something that changed minds and attitudes tremendously. So seeing, that a male same-sex couple could have a photo of them in suits at City Hall getting married or getting domestic partnered, and then suddenly their parents feel like it's acceptable to bring him home for Christmas, or their employer thinks it's appropriate to bring this person to a work event. It's a stamp of approval. It's a stamp of approval that this is sanctioned, this is appropriate. And when we have a non-discrimination law, that doesn't just impact Berkeley and Oakland. How many people are being denied housing in Berkeley or Oakland because they're polyamorous or in a platonic partnership? I don't know. But what it does is that every time we pass one of these, we're able to raise awareness that, hey, did you know 80% of us are doing something different? These are the Pew Research stats, worth knowing. And also the nuclear family was only the most prevalent in the 50s and 60s. This is actually a new idea that isn't working for many people. And if it didn't work for you, it's not because something is wrong with you. There are other options. So it's raising awareness, and it's also making that discrimination unacceptable. Once we have places now, several cities in Massachusetts and in California, and soon to be in New York State, saying this discrimination is inappropriate. We have psychologists, we have the American Psychological Association saying there's absolutely nothing wrong with these families for their stability or for the impact on children. We have the data about how prevalent they are. And that goes a long way toward reducing discrimination and raising awareness for all of us.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this is so important. And I loved how you talk about the coalition of lawyers and mental health professionals. I think this is an unexpected coalition, but so important and so relevant for this work.
It's very important also because it's one thing for me to say, hey, the previous studies had just made a jump from stability to that needs to be a married mother and father, and you could take my word for it. But it's also very helpful to have the American Psychological Association say, yes, that's true. Yes, we have many prominent psychologists that now agree that that was the way, that was a leap historically that happened.
Yeah.
The way that we may have imagined that in early in anthropology, that scientists that said anything other than, and then the husband and wife became monogamous and lived in a cave, just the two of them. Anybody else might be cast out or face persecution. So the only narrative that was written was, yep, it was like a monogamous married cave household. That's what early human anthropology was.
Yes.
And now everyone's saying, no, that's not actually what happened at all, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's just helpful to have these different kinds of professionals who can band together and say, actually, yes, we all had maybe persecution, fear about speaking out, cultural blind spot, which I have empathy for. But now I think it's time to be able to say we have the option and the freedom to do something different.
Absolutely. I have one last question before we go to some questions from the public. And my last question is like, legislation, as you said, is very important because it gives you that stamp of approval. But what else? What else is needed to really make this systemic change of accepting a wider range of family situations? So what else? And I would say, I would add to that one, what can other people that might be listening to us do to help move this agenda forward? Because sometimes people would be like, okay, what can I do to move this agenda forward? So maybe you have some ideas there.
I appreciate both those questions. I'll address first, what can people do to move it forward? I think that it's helpful to be mindful about those kinds of circumstances and people around us. There's this idea of covering in workplaces that many of us are doing, may have something about us. The majority of us may have something about us that we feel like is something we need to hide at work. And that actually creates distance. You know, for many people, maybe it's that I'm hearing impaired and I don't want anyone to know that. I don't want anyone to know that I have a disability. But I stressed out at work because I'm worried I won't be able to hear what's happening. You know, people don't want to share disability issues. People don't want to share what their family status is. Maybe there's somebody who's not showing up at the company picnic because they're a single parent and they feel really isolated if it's focused on couples, right? And so thinking in the small ways around us, how we can make people feel welcome and help normalize these other kinds of family situations and structures, whether that's including them in workplaces, including that in talking about diversity and equity, when we're talking about family structure, that it's not just couples, supporting family leave policies that don't emphasize that you have to be a biological parent to take family leave, allowing sick leave for anybody you designate as a family member. That's one of our on the growing edge of family medical leave. California did that, where, you know, if I say my best friend of 35 years is a family member, and if she's got surgery, I'm leaving work. Trust me, trust people that they're going to be honest about that and not exploit that. If somebody wants to take someone to the hospital, it's probably for a good reason and not because they want a day off work, right? Trust each other and be generous about that in our own spaces. But then also, I think I encourage all of us to think about ways that we could be banding together more outside of the walls of our households, because I'm so sick of the idea that I think we have, especially in the US, of that mothers are expected to mother like they don't have jobs and work like they don't have children. And it puts this impossible burden on women. Many of us are extremely isolated and frustrated. And, you know, we respond with these memes about, you know, mommy's having a restrict on drinking wine in the bathroom. It doesn't have to be that way. We could be banding together. And so offering other parents support, checking in. I suggested a childcare cooperative in New York City. And also, hey, we don't each need to own a car. Do we want to co-own a car? And whenever I suggest things like that, people are like, yes, please, let's do that. But I encourage other people to suggest that, to also check in on single people in your life. You know, does a single friend have somebody to be with them when they're at the hospital, if they have a medical issue coming up? Do they have somebody who can be there to be their healthcare proxy, make medical decisions? Do they feel supported? Do they have someplace to go for the holidays? There's lots of ways that I think we can be more inclusive and be aware of the ways that these kinds of issues are challenging. And then in terms of ways that we still have barriers and what's next, no matter what I do to create more expansive domestic partnership in the US, it is still the case that the US in particular, having also lived in Germany for nearly 7 years, has an over-reliance on marriage as a social welfare state, that we have not created a robust social welfare state and instead have a breadwinner model of health insurance to share with your family. And I'm able to piecemeal say, okay, well, now you can share it with your domestic partners, except that, ultimately we should all have universal medical care because we're humans and have human dignity. And this has been done, throughout Western Europe and much of the developed world, and we can do it. We have the option to do it if it's actually a priority, if it's actually how we want to spend our money as a government, as a society. And I think that this is partly realizing how many people are marginalized by being left out when marriage is the focus, and marriage gets so much of those kinds of tax benefits and those kinds of financial incentives, and that we can all be pushing for policies that support all children, all parents, all humans, so that we don't have to be relying on marriage. And ultimately, what I'd like to be doing is unbundling some of those rights from marriage so that we all just get them as citizens. And that's also part of recognizing and elevating this idea of domestic partnership, that so many of us don't have that and have other people who are not our married romantic partner we'd like to share these kinds of benefits with.
Yes, to all of that. I'm going to get a couple of questions that are being asked by the people that are here listening. One of them is, which are the countries that are being pioneers in this new way of designing families and changing laws? And in which countries would you like to scale your work?
I love that. I really appreciate having this international audience and discussion. I'm curious which countries people are from. And as I mentioned, I'm quite involved in European and US issues because I lived in Germany for some time. And I think that put a radical fire in my belly about just how much, in looking at comparative policy and actually living in the EU, just how much it's obvious some problems in the US we could solve if we cared enough to. There are issues that we could be working on here and just giving everybody better medical access, for example. I think that it's our root issue of racism in the US and our xenophobia, and trying to feel united as a really large and diverse society that is keeping us from being willing to share those kinds of benefits. And I think that we need to really get at that cultural wound of racism and othering before the US can get past that. So I will say that in terms of the ability to create family structure differently, there is a tremendous amount of leadership in Scandinavia, for example, when a friend of mine, a male friend of mine who lived in Finland, would talk about how in Finland and Sweden, young men would talk about how they were a little bit worried with dating women. Does this woman just want to get pregnant and leave? It's the opposite of a narrative that we would have, in the US. Is this man going to get pregnant and leave me? And then I'm left alone. Instead, it was this maybe young women saying, I don't need to have a male partner to have a baby because I will be able to be okay. I will get social supports if I want to be a mother, and that won't be shamed. And I'll be able to live as a parent. And if I want to have a male partner with me, that's great. But I'm not doing it because, oh my God, my child doesn't have health insurance if I don't do that, right? Otherwise, my child will be on the state Medicaid program and it won't cover their treatments. And so I have to be partnered to somebody who has good health insurance. So there's a different level of the way that I think American women in particular are coerced into these kinds of relationships that you're not experiencing as much in Scandinavia in particular. I think you see that to some extent also in Germany. But then in a different direction, I think that because we've had to push for these kinds of rights, there is a more vibrant, organized movement around these kinds of rights in the US that I haven't seen elsewhere.
I think so too. I think so.
And that's partly, when people say, look, why was the same-sex marriage movement so robust and powerful and earlier in the US? Well, it's because we had to, because people didn't have health insurance. People were feeling really financially marginalized. And that's been the basis for why we've won Supreme Court cases, that you're marginalized without it. And that in much of Europe, it wasn't as if this was maybe a political gesture. and very socially and very meaningful in terms of social recognition, but it was something that was less life or death in terms of finances in Europe to need to push for same-sex marriage. And now in a similar way, we have a much more organized movement in the US around these kinds of multi-partner domestic partnership laws. But I'm really excited about the proposal in Germany, and I would love to get connected with anybody involved with that. That was about, they framed it differently, which I really liked, which was about a friendship community. But actually they framed it differently, but used the same definition that we used for being able to declare one or two, a few people, these are my special family people. And it was a recognition of how many people in German society are single, as in not living with a romantic partner, but may think of their best friend as their closest person. That's a rising movement that's gotten more organized in the US and in Germany. And then it's really interesting, just recently in India, right along with proposing same-sex marriage, there was a proposal for another kind of status like this that would be for multi-partner domestic partnership, something similar. And they focused in India on the rights of disabled people, and that for disabled people, there's a benefit to having more than one relationship in your life, and that can be more sustainable for many people, so that there's not an overburdening of one partner. Other partners can have other kinds of freedom. So it was very interesting. We framed it differently in different places, but I'm really grateful that this conversation is now happening worldwide. And in India, I think they knew we're not going to get either of these, but we're going to go ahead and push for the more radical one at the same time as same-sex marriage, because the cultural conversation is shifting in that direction. And I'm really excited about that worldwide movement. Also, Cuba's family code has been updating on their definition of family. So there really is a worldwide rumbling about this that I think is also related when we look at the reduced marriage and childbirth rates in South Korea and in Japan. People continue to have the same conversation they have in the US, which is, how can we get women to get married? Because we need women to be having children. And women saying, no, I don't want to iron someone's shirts all day. Why would I do this? I have my own job. I could go on vacation with my friends. I don't want to do that. So you have to update what family means and get with what's happening culturally and observe, I think, rather than continue to try to push people into these boxes, because we're still having a conversation in Asia, in South America, in the US about, how can we push more women to get married so that we can create more families and we can have more children. And I think instead of trying to push women, women are now done being pushed. We would like to say, I have options, and I would rather maybe be in a more egalitarian partnership, or I'd rather co-parent with my best friend. Let's observe what's actually happening and find ways of providing stability rather than try to shoehorn people into a historical idea.
I think that's extremely exciting, especially taking into account, I think the challenge of our societies in the West becoming or living more years, and becoming older.
Right.
I think with all this, all the expansive and creative framework that you propose makes much more sense than you're trying to push the old ways into people, which are definitely not working. We have a lot of questions, Diana. I think this chat could last for an hour. I'm going to go for another one, which is, what are some surprising allies that can be part of furthering the movement for this movement for the good of all? Any surprising allies that you've
I think seen? There are a number of actually fairly conservative single people who may live in rural areas and feel very isolated. And that was a surprising demographic who responded well and resonated with my TED Talk, for example, by bringing in, I'm talking about transgender issues and polyamorous issues, and that can be seen as very radical. And so it was very interesting that there were a number of people who thought of themselves as politically conservative who resonated and said, yeah, I feel completely left out. I'm left out socially, but I'm also left out financially. I feel like I have a singles tax all the time. There are a lot of really angry, frustrated single people, and that goes across political spectrums. Also, it's been interesting with the asexual community that there are many people who are now speaking out and saying, I don't want to have to be in a romantic relationship in order to have partnership in my life. And so they've been allies in thinking about platonic partnership, in thinking about platonic co-parenting. And so I find it really interesting how much these ideas have the potential for resonating with so many people. Also, separated parents. The majority of American children do not live in a nuclear family with just their parents. And that is in part because many of them are shuttling back and forth between a separated mom and dad. And if you include those kinds of people who are doing that, that's a vast population in the US, and they actually are doing parenting the way that
Yes.
maybe a female same-sex couple who's co-parenting with their gay best friend rather than have him as a sperm donor, that's a 3-parent family, or a polyamorous 3-parent family. And there are many more people who can be allies with that and understand those queer issues who maybe never would have thought of themselves as identifying with queer issues by saying, yeah, I'm a divorced dad and I have a stepmom for my child, and as well as the mother of my child. And I would want, if it would be terrible for my child if the stepmother was not able to stay connected to the children. It would be terrible for the children. And also, why should they not be able to inherit from her as her legal parent? Why can't they get her good health insurance, right? So there's lots of people who can relate to this, I think, by broadening it beyond just LGBTQ issues.
This is amazing. So many things to change. One more question. It says, do you think that raising children and maternity should be a shared social responsibility where everyone should contribute to? This could shift the responsibility to all society and not just only women and family. Then anyone can play a role in bringing up new citizens.
I absolutely think that this is something that is a responsibility for all. And I think that that's something I also saw in action living in Germany, that we all benefit when the idea there that we all benefit when children are educated young and we can be banding together. And it doesn't help any of us if a child is school age and has not been read to, if we're not identifying challenges at home for the child, if the child doesn't have shared values, right, of mutual respect. So it's going to be helpful for all of us if these parents are supported. And I find that idea fascinating, and it makes me realize just how much we have pushed people into boxes in the US. I think partly by a vast geographic distance, you can physically put people out of sight, but that we allow tremendous amounts of child poverty and suffering of parents as if it's not our responsibility, and frankly, as if it's not going to impact us. Because if you
Absolutely.
allow children to be undereducated, abused, traumatized, that will impact your society, right? And
Of
so
course.
I would like to be focusing on this from a place of we care about children and we care about well-being of each other. But if I have to, I will also remind people that this isn't going to work out just on your own base selfish interests. And I think we really need that lesson in the US and can learn a tremendous amount from Europe and places like Germany, where I really experience a tremendous amount of support for parents, where you get Elterngeld. I would get money every month, just as being a parent, whether I need it or not. And
Yeah.
there's not a question like there was in the US of the welfare queen. I'm going to be spending it all on alcohol and cigarettes and not on my child. There's just trust parents, right? A basic level of trust in each other's decision making, and that mutual care and respect, I think, is really essential and something we've really lost in the US that we can really learn from other places.
Yeah. It's still, even within Europe, there's still, I think, a big difference between some countries like,
Yes.
Germany or the Nordics and southern countries, where I think the situation might be looking a little bit more like the US. An interesting question for people like us that have worked on activism and trying to change things before. The question is, what do you think about the strategies of moving the ball, like one step closer, so like more moderate strategies, versus the more radical? Let's push for the kind of radical change that we actually need. So what do you think about that? I mean, like both can be important. Moderate change can make small positive changes for real people today, but then incremental change can really make the need for big changes less obvious and urgent. So how do you find that balance in your work?
I think about that quite a bit, and that's often a big discussion among activists in this space. And so, for example, with getting multi-partner domestic partnership, maybe we're making it feel easier to allow more people to get multi-partner domestic partnership so that we don't all need universal health care, right? I think we can do both. I think we can be pushing for universal health care, but I think from my experience of having worked with hundreds and hundreds of people who are suffering right now, my perspective is I want to get that baby health insurance right now. I want to get your partner with cancer health insurance right now. I want to get them the benefits right away. I want you to be able to visit your partner across a border, your best friend in the hospital. And I can realize just how urgent these issues are for people. But also, I think that with those kinds of multi-partner domestic partnership, I think is incremental change toward the universal health care. But also, I think that the incremental change that we make with that is part of getting toward the universal healthcare, because every single time we can talk about how many people don't have health insurance. And that's why this is so important, and raise awareness about that and say, and we shouldn't even have to go get registered because we all should just be able to have this kind of health coverage. And there are plenty of places that are doing it. And I'll help you figure out the budget. We can compare the policies if you want to. But for right now, this month, we can get people health coverage. And so I think that the incremental change can raise awareness about this larger issue and continue pushing us forward toward that, because ultimately what we're achieving right now is not anything still like, marriage, federal marriage in the US. And it's only going to be happening in the blue dot, really progressive places in the US, and make people realize that, well, great if you live in Berkeley or Oakland or Cambridge or maybe New York City soon, but what about everybody else? And so I'm hopeful that this incremental change will push us toward unbundling some of those rights for marriage in a more long-term way.
Amazing, amazing. Diana, it's been such an honor and pleasure to be here with you today,
Thank you so much,
discussing
Irene.
this important topic, and helping us see what could the future look like, which I think is what we're looking for in Ashoka Fellows. Thank you so much.
Thank you
I
so
hope
much.
to see you very soon in Madrid.
Yes, I hope to meet many Ashoka Fellows who are on the call, and look forward to meeting more of the community soon. I'm delighted to be part of it.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining and sharing great questions. You can look out for a follow-up email that is going to come from our Ashoka team with a link to today's conversation, so you can revisit it, you can share it with your friends and your families. Enjoy your evenings, your days, your mornings, everyone, and see you next time for Welcome Change. We'll be speaking next time with Jimena Bogavir in Chile about another demographic shift, living longer, and also how can we ensure a lifelong contribution in our lives. See you then. Gracias.